Our club has always been a forum for public figures, thought leaders, and decision makers to share their ideas. Here, we offer access to dynamic political, business, and public personalities.
We are dedicated to encouraging debate on the issues that matter to this city, this province, and this country.
The Canadian Club is one of the most important podiums anywhere in the world that a Canadian can speak to, tell Canadians what it is that they think, develop those thoughts. And so I want to thank you for that very, very much.
Please join me in thanking our esteemed panelists today.
Through our programs and events, including our youth and young leaders programs, our diversity partnerships, our joint events, and our media and social media opportunities, we offer you access to dynamic political, social, and business figures from abroad and right here at home.
The platform from which the eloquence of Canada has flowed all of that time, whether it be business, education, politics, sports, arts, and culture. If someone wants to say something to Canadians about this country and about the future of this country, this is the venue you choose.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Anita McCouet, and I'm the immediate past president of the Canadian Club Toronto and a partner at PwC Canada. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we are on today. While we meet today on a virtual platform, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the land, which we each call home, and we do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations and to improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. Today, in honor of Black History Month, we are here to celebrate. We're celebrating Black creativity, Black leadership, and Black agency with a panel of some of Canada's most accomplished leaders, Alica Hall, Charlene Theodore, Ray Williams, and David Simmonds. But before we hear from today's speakers, a couple of housekeeping items. First, if you find that your internet is slow, try hitting the click here to switch stream button on your feed. The video quality may decrease, but the audio should stay strong. And secondly, we do want your questions today. So just click the questions tab, type your question in the window, and it will be sent directly to our moderator. The Canadian Club is a nonprofit, and we've been gathering people together for 125 years. And it's because of our sponsors, partners, and members that we're able to do so. So I do want to take a moment to thank today's sponsors for helping us make this event possible. Thanks to the generous support of TD, McCarthy Tétrault, and Power Corporation of Canada, today's event is free of charge. Now, one of the club's traditions that has not changed in this virtual world is the toast that we make to our country at the start of every event. So if you have any type of beverage nearby, please raise your glass and join me in a toast to Canada. To Canada. Now, I'd like to turn the podium over to Scott Belton, Senior Vice President, Canadian Personal Banking Strategy and Acquisition for TD Bank, to introduce today's speakers.
Thank you very much, Anita. A warm welcome to everyone. Black History Month can be many things, a reminder of the incredible and too often overlooked role that Black people play in our history. A time to reflect on deeply rooted anti-Black racism, both from the past and that which exists today, and a chance to hold ourselves and the institutions around us accountable against commitments they've made to be better. Black History Month, though, can also be about joy, a chance to celebrate and amplify the awesome Black leaders, Black creators, and overall Black excellence that we are so grateful exists in this country. And that's exactly what we are doing today at the Canadian Club. At TD, we will continue the very important work not only of addressing inequity internally, but also in supporting Black customers and communities externally. And we are delighted to sponsor today's event, a celebration of Black joy. It is my pleasure to introduce Alica Hall, the Executive Director of the Nia Centre for the Arts, Charlene Theodore, Chief Inclusion Officer, McCarthy Tétrault, Ray Williams, Managing Director and Vice Chairman, Financial Markets, National Bank Financial, and a co-founder and now chair of the Black Opportunity Fund. And now I'd like to turn the podium over to David Simmonds, Senior Vice President, Global Chief Communications and Sustainability Officer, Great West Lifeco and Canada Life, and the President of the Canadian Club of Toronto. David, over to you.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks for hosting us today, for being our sponsor, and for being a member of the board of the Canadian Club. You do great work, and we really appreciate you being with us. And thank you to our panelists today, 3 incredible and inspiring Canadians who are doing fantastic work to celebrate my people, our people, Black people across the country. It's a great day. And if we were in person, I'd probably sing a little Sankey, as we called it in church growing up, to celebrate today being a great day. So what brings us together? You know, one of the things that we wanted to do as we kick off today's discussion is to just really have a common definition of what we mean by Black joy, what we feel when we hear and we say that. There's a lot of discussion around honoring the resilience, creativity, and vitality of Black people in Canada. So I'm going to ask each of the panelists, when you hear Black joy, what does that mean to you? What does that feel like? What does that look like? And Charlene, maybe I'll start with you.
For me, the term Black joy means it's all about context, right? And so when you're either doing work in anti-Black racism specifically, or just kind of existing in the, in corporate Canada as a professional, I think you have to recognize that a lot of the work that needs to be done is long-term work. And if you don't kind of center yourself in joy and focus on some of the immediate and small things, the work isn't sustainable. And so I think it's kind of the counterpoint to the complexity and the gravity of the work that must be done, because it can't be done with just a sole focus on what they like to call Black pain or Black trauma. You have to have some counterbalance, or we'll all go crazy.
Yes, we will. It's interesting. I often talk about being raised in an environment where I was raised by Black ministers. I talk about it a lot. My grandparents were Black ministers. And so there was a resilience and a joy in the struggle. And we would often talk about not being able to separate this promise, this idea of something better as you live through the reality of it.
Exactly.
And so there's some reflection there. Thank you for sharing that. Ray, you have done some incredible things. You work in a space that's pretty traditional, if I can say. I don't use that to be diminutive. I say it because it's often true. And you've started something that's quite tremendous in the Black Opportunities Fund with your colleagues there. Black joy for you in your space and what you're doing, what does that look like?
I would say more so than anything else, it's about how I engage with community, what I can deliver to community to create change. Those are really fundamental aspects for me of what that might look like. Because in undertaking the work, you hope that there is an outcome along the way. And it's actually quite surprising the amount that's actually given back in the process. So, we are taking space, but as my friend likes to say, we're also creating space along the way. And that in itself allows for so many others to fill that space. And that gives me joy. That is Black joy.
Alica, you, if I can just say, you're a presence, and I admire you so much and the work that you do. I've seen you move from deep activism in our country to make sure that we give voice and volume to people in our community who are often on the margins in our community and bring that out. And I'm watching you build this incredible movement through arts, culture, and creativity. So Black joy in your perspective and your experience, give us voice and give us words in that space.
Thank you, David, for the kind words. I think for me, Black joy is really rooted in self-determination. When Black people are able to create work, to participate in activities, are able to shape their communities in ways that they see fit. And too often, our policies, our funding, things are done to Black people, right? Communities are created for them. There are restrictions, there are limitations on what they can do. And so joy for me is when I see artists in particular and creatives able to dream up and create work that is inspired and grounded in what they see as part of, Black futures. It's often imagined, right? It's often things that we're actively working on creating. And I think that self-determination is very connected to our liberation. And that's where Black joy is really coming from for me. Any activity that we're really directing for ourselves.
I love that. I hear agency, such a powerful word, right? Opportunity, we've heard about legacy. So how do we promote agency then? How do we do that? Any thoughts or tips for us in exercising agency?
Well, I'm happy to sort of step in, not unusually so. I think it's in the do it. I think you have to just step into the fray and do it. I mean, there's a lot of conversation that takes place. But as I've heard, talk does not cook rice. So you have to step in and do the work. But there's a certain amount of truth to that. Quite often, when you choose to just drive ahead, you're surprised at the number of people who are willing to walk with you on that journey. But if you don't take that first step, if you don't step into the fray, we can sit back and talk all we want. It makes very little difference ultimately.
Talk doesn't cook rice. I tell you, our West Indian parents are celebrating right now because they raise good children, right? There's a thing that brings us together, as we all know. So let me do this. Let me quote Vice President Harris. When she was nominated to be Vice President of the United States, she said that she was the first, but that she would do the work and hopefully not be the last. And I look at your careers, respectively, you've been the first in many of your spaces in doing this work. And I've often said, given the directory I've had, is that there's great celebration and great satisfaction, and there's joy in that achievement, but there's also a lot of work in that space. Can we give voice to that experience that you've been through? What's working in the work that we're doing? What's not working? And what do we need to hear and sort of label today in our communities? Maybe Charlene, I'll start with you.
Yeah, so I'm now immediate past president of the Ontario Bar Association, but in 2020, September of 2020, I began my term, excuse me, as the first Black president of the organization and only the 10th woman. And given that the organization, as I think at this point, 119 years old, and you look at the fact that each president has a one-year term, it is staggering, right? In terms of the amount of opportunities that the legal profession had to get it right, quite frankly, right? And I think one piece of advice I would offer from my experience of being the first, there's definitely a lot of pressure. I felt a lot of pressure, and a lot of it was self-imposed, self-imposed. But I think that when we are first to get in those positions, we have to, when there is opportunity, not just put our own stamp on it, but to, in terms of being authentic, which I did, but look at the position and how the position should work differently. So one of the initiatives that I started, it is more and more difficult. So any CEO or chair of board that has a term, right? If you look at your counterparts from 10, 15 years ago, it always seems that they had less on their plate. Whatever, all the leadership positions, whether it's president of an association, chair of a board, CEO, there is a lot more on your plate now that you are demanded to do to add to your already, diverse set of skills as a leader. And with a one-year term, what I did is I said, it is hard to be effective in 1 year. So you do, you have to really focus, but I created this initiative called Not Another Decade, where you can take the ethos of your mandate. And my ethos was work that works, right? So creating better workspaces for those equity-seeking groups, including Black and Indigenous people and intersections thereof in the legal profession. And so by establishing Not Another Decade and downloading some of that institutional commitment to the organization itself, you then have a 10-year mandate that's placed within the organization that doesn't disappear when I go, that each president can put their own stamp on and carry forward. And that has not been done, whether you look at the Bar Association, the Advocate Society, or the legal professional associations. And so part of it is really about leveraging our unique perspective and what we have seen and learned from years of being on the outside looking in, and not just bringing authenticity to it, but where you can, using that power to change the way the role works. Because that's really how, you know, as Vice President Harris says, when we say we hope that you won't be the last, it's kind of like, okay, well, I certainly hope, but what can I put in place to make sure that I'm not the last?
Yeah, it's. I heard someone say a few weeks ago from the Black Talent Initiative that racism is a system. And so if we believe that we have to dismantle it, it takes systems and institutions to do that, in addition to individuals in the process. And that's,
absolutely.
In not another decade, Charlene. Alica, you've been chair of boards, you've been a nonprofit CEO. What's that been like for you, and what lessons can we take from this journey?
Well, I really love the point around thinking about systems change. And I think there's no greater sort of investment that we can make right now than in infrastructure. And I'm really proud to be working on a project that's creating physical infrastructure in Toronto. We're creating Canada's first professional multidisciplinary Black Arts Centre just south of Eglinton West. And to me, what that represents is a place both for the community to gather, but also a source of advocacy, right? We can point to the talent within our community. We can incubate new projects and initiatives. So often during this month, we're celebrating, you know, our biggest exports, right? You know, we think about Drake and The Weeknd, and arguably, whatever we think about their music, they are the two biggest artists of the past decade, just by the numbers. They're Canadian, they're from our city in Toronto, and they are producing Black artistic traditions, right? They are reproducing music and culture rooted in our culture. And yet, you know, across the board, whether it's Canada Council for the Arts or other institutions, we're not investing in Black creators. We're not investing in Black artists. We receive the lowest amounts of funding for Black artistic traditions. And so if we're going to ensure that we move from not just having the first, you know, Drake and The Weeknd, you know, The Weeknd performing at the Super Bowl last year, we're moving to, you know, looking at across disciplines, having multiple Black creators be successful and be able to be supported. We need to alter these systems, and we need to value Black creativity and Black artistic production. And that's what I see a key role of Nia Centre being able to do, is advocate and shape and actually create a space to serve as that kind of platform.
That's really powerful. I want to remind the audience, we are getting questions. You can ask a question by the submit a question tab at the bottom of your screen. We have people helping me collect questions here. Alica, I think it's really powerful too, and I'm coming to you, Ray. The power of place is so important. You know, we say Eglinton West, and so many of us are not giving voice to what Eglinton West has been for Torontonians who are Black over the last so many decades, right? It was our space, and there's a whole issue around gentrification in that community and what's happening there. So I think that the center will be very powerful, almost a calling home, right? We might need to come home to Eglinton and make sure that community is taken care of, because so many of us landed there when we came to the city. Ray, Alec is talking about agency, investment, capital, social and financial that's required to do this. I cannot not put you on the spot about the Black Opportunities Fund and what's happening there around building generational, support and infrastructure. So can you talk to me a little bit about the first, because you are the first in a lot of what you've done professionally, but also how you sort of plan to sow a seed to reap a harvest. I'm really getting some credit here for my grandparents today.
Well, you know, let me first start by saying that both the comments from both Charlene and Alica, you know, resonates really very, very deeply with me. But I'll make an additional statement, and that really is that the whole notion of being first in place, we as people of color, we as Black people within the workspace already, we're dealt a heavy emotional burden, just basically as people of color. And then to be first in place, it increases with that. So I'll step back and I'll go back to one of my original statements, the whole notion about taking space to create space. So I won't talk immediately about the Black Opportunity Fund. I'll go back to an organization I'm very proud of that I helped start 26 years ago. Today it's known as the Canadian Association of Financial Professionals. But 26 years ago, working with Stanley Julian, Paget Warner, Delan Kamanga, we created something that created a space for all those that came along thereafter. because we needed to create that space for ourselves in Bay Street. It is a Black financial services organization, a professional trade organization that continues to grow. So that's just one aspect of it. And again, this is reflective of my whole mindset that you need to step into the fray. You can talk about it, it's all fine and well, but talk does not cook rice, as I mentioned, right? And so in every space that I've seen challenges for our community, I've tried to help in a way that is meaningful. I go back to 2012 and engaging with Justice Donald McLeod and a bunch of great Black men, because we had identified a situation where so many of our young Black boys in particular were simply not graduating, right, high school. The number in the GTA from a 2009 or 2010 report was 38.5%. Hearing something like that as a father of a Black boy, now a young man, how could I not, engage in trying to create change? And therein came along 100 Strong. We've been going, this year will be 10 years strong. It took us a while to get going, but each year we're now in a position to directly engage with young Black boys in the community, where we're changing the narrative for our community. We're creating very particular spaces where those young men can look at themselves in a light and with a narrative that is not generated by anyone apart from themselves. And there is also an additional component to that, because those Black men and now Black women who have joined us on this journey, what it represents is an opportunity to see it, to be it. So we take them and we show them, this is what success looks like, and we come from the same place that you do. Black Opportunity Fund, more recently, is just a continuation in that journey from where I sit. It represents how we deal with some of the challenges our Black community faces in a whole bunch of areas. Not only for Black entrepreneurs, but one of the things, Alica, you'll be very pleased to hear, is that we stated very clearly that arts and culture is such an important part of our overall mindset and who we are, that it has to be in there. So while many people think, oh, this guy is from Bay Street, it's about business, the components and the pieces that represent who we are as a people speaks very, very clearly to me. So it's not just about business, it's about the not-for-profits and charitable organizations that have done the work at a grassroots level for many years, quite often toiling in a way that does not get them any kind of appreciation, but there is appreciation out there, and we have to support those organizations, and we have to create, again, we have to create our own spaces. We have to take the leadership role about what this thing should look like, what the outcome should look like, who is directing that narrative. We have to be in the position to do so.
Here, I take space to create space as a takeaway. I've written that down. I just want to also use this opportunity to memorialize some of the things that we're hearing today, because sometimes I think we miss these movements, right? So 100 Strong, Not Another Decade, the Nia Centre for the Arts. You mentioned Dylan, who's at BMO now, as a group head at BMO, and he does tremendous work with you. He's doing work with a group of Black alumni from Western who have a storied history and experience there to make sure that we're being held accountable for the change journey that needs to happen across higher education. So lots of leaders in this country doing the important work to move the dial on this. Ray, you mentioned creativity, and I want to call out, Alica had mentioned the work that she's doing. How do we, so we affirm identity through culture, right? I think we know that to be true. Literature, art, creativity. There is a little bit of a bias around what Black culture looks like through all of these different expressions. How do we make sure that we don't lose the joy of Black creativity and culture, but also create this spaces where I think about, you mentioned Drake in The Weeknd, Alica, but I think about my brother is a musician. I think about Julie Black. I think about Cardinal Fischel. I think about that cohort of us, the creators, who were kind of, looked at like a kind of a, in a way, if I can use the expression at the time. So how do we do that? How do we build that pipeline of cultural expression in a way that we can celebrate it?
Yeah, and it's an important one to note that, I think Drake and The Weeknd get a lot of, visibility because they've been successfully exported. But we've now, I think, over the past couple of years, done a lot more work to focus on local homegrown talent that still, made an important contribution to the landscape. So I thank you for bringing those folks up. But I think to your point around, Black stories matter, representation matters, being able to have work that reflects our stories that are written and produced by us is really quite important. And we know that the gap is quite significant, right? It's only in 2019 that Vanessa Antoine became the first Black woman to be the lead in a show in Canada, right? We know that only 9.5% of Black people have speaking roles in drama and comedies in Canada. So too often our stories are not represented and reflected in the Canadian media landscape, whether that is TV, film, literature, et cetera. And too often, as you mentioned, they rely on stereotypes and tropes that are centuries old, right? We have very limited options for how we're able to tell our story and how we show up on screen or in our museums and galleries. The AGO has never produced a solo exhibition of a Black Canadian artist, right? There are still many firsts that we're waiting for. And so I think to move from waiting to actually creating, we need to invest in our creators, right? That's one of the things that we're trying to do through Nia Centre, is to give them opportunities to create without the limitations of saying, well, that's not really a story that's Black enough, That's not really a piece of work that speaks to what I understand as a Black experience. One of the things that we have to remember in Canada is that we are part of a diaspora. And so we have a very diverse community, right? We are East African, we're West African, we're Caribbean, we're queer, we're trans, we're Afro-Indigenous, we're Francophone. So we really have to create narratives that exist at those intersecting points and show the beautiful makeup. It's very rare right now. There are not many places you can go in the world where, a Somali community and a Jamaican community are living, next door to each other. And we need to embrace that. And so for me, that's only going to be done if we're investing in Black creators across disciplines and not putting restrictions on what we think Black stories are, not qualifying that.
Yeah, I think that's really powerful. One of the discussions I often have in the spaces and places that I'm in is, I get the question from white folks, what can I do and how can I help? And one of the reflections I'll have is, advocating and wanting Black people to win is an important piece of that narrative or a piece of that work or that systems change. Charlene, you have a very important role at a national law firm as a practicing lawyer who is president of the Bar Association. How do you help your colleagues understand the daily work that has to happen to be in the corner of change and also the long-term investments that need to be put in place to drive that change?
Well, I'll preface my answer by saying I was very privileged to walk into a very good situation. Unlike many in the legal and professional spaces, the Inclusion Now framework at McCarthy's, which is essentially our the way that we've integrated all aspects of EDI into all aspects of running the business, right? It's not a standalone group or program. My mandate touches across the firm. It includes everything from hiring to salaries, promotions, equity, looking at benefits in terms of trans inclusion, EDI data. So I walked into a program that was launched in 2019, right? I walked into a space where they had made a decision. The owners of the business had made a decision before many people were forced to make a decision about how they wanted their workplace culture to be, what really was a sustainable business culture in terms of the way we treat people, looking at the increasingly and continuously diverse cohorts coming out of law school. Like we have one hiring pool, and making sure that their business was sustainable in the sense that, are we going to be relevant and impactful in the place to be 50 years from now, right? So looking beyond, any one CEO's mandate. And so I came into, I would say, a great situation. I'll give you an example in terms of how we frame it in terms of practicing. So for example, this Black History Month, we are talking in line with our firm's commitment to wellness, which we've really leaned into during the pandemic. We're talking about Black mental health and allyship as kind of two sides of the same coin. And the reason is this: we know right? So my white counterparts, my counterparts who are just not Black at the firm, we all know that we've gotten our education to the point that we all know that we live allyship, we practice allyship principles every day because each one of us has a role to play in the lived experience of our Black colleagues. The other side of that coin is, we all know, and the most recent federal health data says that a lifetime of microaggressions, trauma, overt racism, subtle racism leads to poor mental health outcomes in Black communities specifically. And we come with our own narratives across the diaspora about mental health, what it is, seeking help, whether that's medication or talk therapy. And so we're playing both sides of the coin, right? So we're working on, again, leaning into our allyship so that we continue to be aware that we all, every day, every interaction has an effect on your colleagues' lived experience. And then we're having another session for our Black colleagues and allies on Black mental health with a Black mental health and wellness advocate to ensure that, you know, there are tons of mental health resources that we offer at the firm that are filled with Black mental health advocates, Black mental health champions, people that can offer that culturally specific piece. But if for some reason that whatever narrative you grew up with about identifying mental health as something that you should be actively nurturing, if that's stopping you from engaging with those resources, here are some extra community supports for you. And so kind of by engaging everyone in the conversation and carving out space for Black people, I think that's how we keep it moving, because everyone in this specific law firm context, everyone has to have an interest in the wellness and the advancement and the promotion of our Black colleagues, and we all do, right? And, you know, we also don't just talk about mental health during February. We had a firm-wide meditation workshop last month. And, you know, because myself and the powers that be are convinced that especially during this time, taking care of your mental health and wellness make you a better leader. And so we take the existing firm principles, but we make sure that where there are specific tools that our folks need, that they get that support and they get those resources.
I think that's really powerful, really, really powerful. One of the questions I got at work was, should we create Black spaces at work? Like, is work the place to have Black spaces? And my reflection on it was yes, because in order to truly celebrate, you need to be comfortable in the celebration and the expression. And there are some Black exercises that unite us that are our expression. Do you agree with that? Do you think that we ought to be creating Black spaces, not necessarily exclusionarily Black, but Black spaces to have that celebration and to have that sort of camaraderie? Is that part of our health journey? Should we be thinking that way?
Absolutely. And it's more than part of the health journey. It's part of the culture. It's what defines you, the way people interact together, right? And the platforms that you provide for the platforms and spaces that you provide for your employees to do your best work. So whether it's a parents of trans children group, right? Whether it's for our Jewish book club, right? That is what's really going to define you as a place this place to be, and a place where you can bring your authentic self to work and stay and thrive. So of course there should be Black spaces at work, but those spaces should be driven by the needs of the Black community and in your workplace. And then there's a way to do that in terms of taking account their needs and not making them do the labor.
Yeah,
that's the trick that most people don't get. I wrote an article for the Law Times last year about the origin of ERGs and what they were intended for and what they're being used for now. They originated in the 70s. Xerox was the first one to have one for their Black employees, and Blacks entering kind of corporate America at that time. It was seen as, you know, a place of support, a place, again, we know that you guys need this space, we're gonna put you together so they could thrive. But the one thing that Xerox did right, which has fallen off as a bit of a practice, is by using that space as a place to pour into, not just to take from. Right?
Wow.
So what do you need as professionals? Do you need a speaker? Do you need help in terms of networking? Right? And that's the model that we use at McCarthy's, right? Of course, you want people to be heard. Our action groups, we have a race action group, an abilities action group, a gender action group, and a pride action group. And that framework, right, allows for people to be heard, to generate good ideas, to make sure people like me that are at the C level know what the changing needs of all of our people are, but we also pour into them. They're well-resourced. Each group is headed by an equity partner because the people, those are the owners of the firm, right? They decided to pull up their sleeves and do the work. And so I think that model is really what was envisioned with the action group. It's just coincidence that I wrote a news article on ERGs, what their purpose is, what their purpose should be, and the fact that this system had already been established at McCarthy's, which is again, one of the many reasons I decided to make it my home, because they were doing things in terms of EDI at the level of sophistication and with the resourcing that I know is required in this time. So well, yes, you should have Black spaces, but what are they used for? Mm-hmm. Right.
So Charlene, I got to say that, you know, I have to applaud McCarthy's based on how far ahead of the curve they are, based on what you just shared with us. I think it's amazing. And, you know, as an adjunct to some of your initial statements about where ERG started, you know, it's just really quite interesting that along the way, generally speaking, Black people end up, Black employees end up being sort of de facto unpaid labor and diversity consultants internally. So the whole concept of not just extracting, but providing goes an awfully long way to creating the type of environment you want for all your employees, not just Black employees, but all your employees. I mean, when people feel connected, engaged, and included, guess what? They're going to be in a happy space. They're going to know joy within the workspace, not just Black people, you know. But we are talking about it from our perspective, that particular perspective, and it is an important one because, as I've stated previously, you know, there's a heavy emotional tax that's, you know, really most Black people within a professional work environment and within a lot of work environments really pay. Yeah. You know, I basically say you should have at least 3 extra days of holidays just for that. That's just me.
Well, you know, it's interesting you say that, Ray, not that we should all have, I mean, I'll leave that one for debate by another party, but Charlene's point around how do you pour into, right? I think in life, there's many refillings of energy and there's many refillings of how you sort of get that strength. And for better or for worse, I've told this story on other platforms. When I was in my previous company, we would always do our executive retreats in what were traditionally white spaces and places. And they were exhausting for me. And then I thought about, what about the women executives who are coming here and have to get into, you know, these spaces that are, and I made the joke once to my old CEO, we were in New Hampshire, and I was like, this is the worst possible place for a Black man to be. I have to go into the water on this boat with you, and you don't understand the actness of my skin. Like and I say this with like, sincerely, you're taking away my strength and my power. So I couldn't imagine what it's like for other people. And I think about the progress. I worked at a firm that is owned by an openly gay man who's been, you know, a leader in queer and LGBT activism. And part of seeing the positive space, the daily ability to just let go and be refilled in that space is almost an inspiration for what we may need to do in other equity-seeking communities and populations. So I really applaud and appreciate that. I'm getting so many questions from online here. You are just being an inspiration. There's a trend here, and I want to acknowledge that we are in a refilling environment, but there is a trend around the work that we need to do. And there is some, I'm seeing 3 or 4 questions here around, you know, are we moving fast enough? You know, what more can we be doing to push leaders who have the capacity to be able to do this work, and this work being professionals in the spaces and places that we're in. So, you know, I just want to acknowledge that the question is being asked, and if you've got reflections or thoughts that you might want to share, I'd throw it to the group.
So here is what I tell people all the time. When it comes to doing this work, so first of all, are we moving fast enough? I am happy that there has been a shift, a tremendous shift to what EDI is kind of known for, right? That came out of tragic events, right? So the murder of George Floyd, Regis Pekinchikuriket, I'm sorry I butchered her name, a new reckoning our relationship with Indigenous peoples. I think the critical point that we're at now, as we begin a slow return to work, to old traditions and to old routines, is for us to keep our foot on the gas and not let that momentum slide, because historically it has happened over and over again, right? Like Alica said, when we're talking about agency, right, we haven't had, yes, there is a lot to be said about creating things on our own, but we live in a system in society, especially in the art space, you know, in the professional space, the powers that be are still the powers that be while we're doing this work. So now is the moment to kind of grab, you know, whatever time we're in and keep building out and keep amplifying, right? And I would worry about structural systems and making sure those are in place as opposed to speed. Because I think just now in 2022, that's the critical time we're at. And when it comes to measuring progress, again, you can't survive doing this work if you only have one timeline. Right? You have to be able to say, to attach reasonable timelines to the task that is given, right? So everything from like diversifying a particular legal department, right? Vendor diversity, you know, being more responsive to intersectionality and queer spaces within the Black community, within the South Asian community, within the Indigenous community. Those are things that you can kind of balance off, right? I think that, and I don't want to imply that vendor management, procurement, especially during this time, is not a complex thing, but in the realm compared with ultimately transforming the faces of people that work in a company of over 4,000, right? That is more of a longer term project. Whereas I think vendor diversity in many ways is something that you can integrate into your systems as kind of a quick win. So I try and have parallel goals, right? So what can I kind of do to have an impact now while I'm working on this for the future? I think it speaks to your stakeholders, your market, your employees, your clients. When you look at it from the outside looking in, it will look like constant movement, but to yourself, you have to have short, medium, and long-term goals that you're working on simultaneously, as opposed to, which is why I never think of anything in terms of, is this happening fast enough, right? It's about momentum, and it's about transparency where you are in your journey, and it's about accountability.
I agree with all of those points, Charlene. I also feel like the answer is still a resounding no for two reasons. One, because I feel like we've all just kind of arrived at a point where we acknowledge systemic racism. Yeah. And so we've been having this conversation for decades prior to everyone arriving here. As Ray pointed out, he's been working on initiatives like many other leaders in our communities, individually as collectives for a long time. But now everyone is kind of like, oh, we agree this thing is happening. However, I think we're also facing unprecedented conditions. We know that, you know, with the digital economy, with shifts in technology, there are significant changes, climate change ahead of us. And we know that marginalized communities and Black people in particular are disadvantaged by those kinds of conditions because they're already on the margins. And so we do need to move quickly, and we're not moving fast enough. I hear a lot of talk and commitments, and when I get into boardrooms, the conversation changes. And so I think that we need to, yes, think about the long-term game and be clear about those KPIs that we're tracking over years and into a 5-year plan or so, but we also need to think about what we're able to activate now and what is the sort of low-hanging fruit that we can shift and change. And so that would be my response to that one.
I agree.
I think there's two key takeaways there. There's fairness as a principle, and there's justice as a principle, right? And then there's the acceleration of achievement and the acknowledgement of achievement, right? The Black defined achievement should be celebrated in the way that it is, but that should not displace some of the fundamental work that we need to do around fairness and justice. And I think that's a powerful takeaway. Ray, were you trying to get in there?
Yeah, I was just going to quickly say, look, I mean, just heard some fabulous comments from both Alica and Charlene as it speaks to the topic. You know, I'm about to celebrate probably 4 decades in the financial services industry. So I've had the opportunity of quite a bit of a timeline, both in the UK and here. And so the reality is that the needle has moved, but it's really moved very, very slightly. Now, I'm encouraged, however, by the fact that based on where we are today and who's involved, which is to Alica's point, before this, there was lots of conversations within the Black community. But the differential this time is that the people who were out there 2 years ago in 2020 protesting weren't exclusively from the Black community. So there's been a bit of a shift in my mentality, certainly around what I've observed, which is that there is a wider component of society that have acknowledged what we've known for an awfully long while, that have now embraced and is starting to understand some of the struggles we as Black people, you know, continually on a daily basis engage. So I think that has the potential and the opportunity to create a substantial shift going forward.
You know, I absolutely wholeheartedly agree. One thing I will share as a little bit of personal disclosure, just to kind of frame the understanding of what it means like to be Black, a Black Canadian in this time, or Black across the diaspora in this space. Ray is absolutely right. There's been a shift. I keep saying there's been a shift. For me personally, that shift was really, really painful. Aside from George Floyd just being absolutely painful, seeing the worldwide condemnation, seeing structural funding, what do you need, flow from that, was for me something that was one of the things that made the pandemic so very hard for me. And the reason why is I was like, why not when Trayvon Martin happened?
Yes.
Why not when Sandra Bland? What was it about? This has been happening for so long. You know, this has been happening. I remember hearing about this first when I was in, the first time I saw someone get really, really beaten up by the police with bystanders not doing anything. I think I may have been 10. You know, when I was in high school, my boyfriend at the time who lived in a different neighborhood than me, one of the things that we call like the target communities now, would tell me about his monumental journey, going to basketball practice, going to school, and his interactions with police, right? And so when it came, it was a welcome relief to finally see people start to get on board, but be sure that this is something that should have happened so very long ago. For every George Floyd, there are identical violent, murderous interactions with policing, violent, racist interactions with institutions that are just as devastating. And so I think it's important for allies to know the context we're sitting in when they start to engage in this work.
Charlene, you bring up, and I agree with you, and I was moved by the comments because I think the stillness of the pandemic amplified the pain. And I think that it may have the stillness may then have created an opportunity to Alica's point to sort of drive acceleration unapologetically around that. You bring up allyship, and there's a question in the chat around allyship and how, and again, it's the burden of us being in these roles, right, where we are often the only Black person at the table, and everyone turns to us and says, well, how do I be a better ally? So then it's okay, I've got to now teach you to do this work, which is what it is. But the question in the chat is, how should we, and I don't know the identity of the questioner, how do you negotiate authentic allyship that actually drives an outcome versus allyship that then turns into performance and satisfaction on the part of the ally. Like what insights or lessons or thoughts might we share with the audience around, you know, balancing that as an ally? Like I've often said, you do that work, ally, but there's sort of two spaces, performative versus productive, and how do we see the indicator of positive in that space?
I have a reflection just coming to sort of build on Charlene's thoughts, and I really appreciate those comments. I was just like, a word, thank you. Mm-hmm. But, you know, just after George Floyd's death, after Regis's death and murder, in the summer, we were just overwhelmed with donations. And it was like within a span of 2 days, we had launched a new website, and within a span of 2 days, just like, you know, thousands of donations pouring in. And on the one hand, really grateful for the support. We're, you know, undertaking a $10 million capital project, trying to raise the last $1.1 million, you know, need the support. And so we're saying thank you to people. And within like 5 hours, it was like, wait, why are we doing this? It's A, exhausting. B, we're all traumatized and still trying to process everything that's happened. And C, this is just, you know, people are posting and saying that they've made a donation. And it's like, what else is happening here? Is this just the trend of the day? And then, you know, where does the rest of your charitable donations, where's the rest of your support, resources, time, et cetera, go for the remainder of the year, right? And what we know from a research report done by the Black Foundation last year is that only 7 cents of every charitable dollar in Toronto and Canada goes to Black-led charities, right? And so we're really keen as an organization to build reciprocal relationships, to build long-term partnerships, because we know that if we're building and creating new systems, that those are going to take time, and these kinds of relationships are going to take time. And too often the conversation and the resulting activity is extractive. You know, can you promote this program that I've designed for Black artists? Can you promote this, you know, opportunity that I want to create? And I want more Black candidates for this role, right? And it's like, that's a one-way street here, you know? And so how do we actually work together and build a relationship where we can support and amplify what you're doing, but you're also in supporting and amplifying what, you know, Black folks are leading and creating for themselves. And so I think, you know, folks supporting with their time and their energy and their donations is important, but really it has to be reciprocal relationships.
Alica, that is a word, relationship. The allyship is a relationship. And I read a book this year during the pandemic called Big Friendships, and I spoke to some of my closest friends, and the book's thesis is that friendships require an investment. And then the phrase in the book is you need to water the friendship, you need to prune the friendship. And I would almost suggest that being a good ally means watering, pruning, investing, and doing the work to grow that. And you have to, just Charlene's earlier comment, pour into, fill in order for this space to actually be valuable and credible and not to be just a one-way celebration. We have a few minutes left. I am looking to make sure there are no questions that I'm not asking. Yep. I'm going to ask you each to give us your thought of where you get your Black joy. So if there's a space or a place that we want to celebrate or call out, where do you get your Black joy, and how can more Canadians experience that Black joy?
Well, to be honest, it's actually my kitchen.
I was going to say I get mine from Leela's Roti on Doubles. So go ahead, Ray. Go ahead.
Well, so Leela's is good, but yeah, you know, it's one of those things. Look, Black joy comes in so many forms and in so many places. Like for me, the opportunity to engage with my peers, you know, sit down, the cultural shortcuts, the engagement, just breaking bread sometimes, you know, goes an awfully long way to creating that sense of joy in life, relationships, engagement.
Charlene?
I will make a couple points. So I get my Black joy. The entirety of Canada cannot engage in the joy that is my family, but they're pretty awesome. But, you know, I think we have all learned over this pandemic the importance of that family connection, whether it's your chosen family or your family that you were just born into. And I think that for people that are looking to give back in that way to think about what your Black employees need, providing space, providing time, providing avenues for community, even in virtual spaces. And the other thing that I personally get Black joy from is people like Alica. I am a huge fan of art and Black art. I love discovering new art, new talents. I love the work that the Nia Centre is doing. And once you start to learn things like allyship that we were talking about, you'll start to see in your life the same template of inequity. So if you're into food, you're going to start noticing women, racialized people are not in positions of power in the restaurant industry. So that's maybe a way that you can support and give back. If you're into art, the stats on women artists being featured, be they racialized or not, are horrendous, right? You'll start to notice that there are excluded voices there. So once again, you dive into your allyship journey, and it is something that can be learned. We're all very smart people. We've all had to learn skills with regards to whether it's dealing with people, marketing, cross-examination for some of us, right? It is a skill that can be learned and should be, that needs to be in your toolkit as a leader and a professional. You'll start to see those same patterns of inequities elsewhere, and whatever is good for you. If you're passionate about gardening, there's a whole community of Black growers, Black herbivores, I don't know what they call themselves, right? And so pour into what's passionate about you and look for the inequities in spaces that you're in and help elevate people who don't look like you in those spaces.
Alica, where do you get your joy?
I mean, I get my joy from a lot of places, but I feel really privileged to work on really cool projects in my day-to-day work. We actually just published a book called Griot, 6 Writers Sojourn into the Dark. And it's by 6 emerging Black writers who were mentored and supported by Whitney French over the course of the summer last year. And we partnered with Penguin Random House to publish this chapbook of their writings, which is available today on Apple, Google, anywhere that you get books. And being able to create those kinds of tangible examples of Black stories and supporting artists without limitations and paying them for their work brings me immense joy, because I think one of the things we have to remember is we're all creating history in our lives. Too often we celebrate those who make it to the highest echelons of our society, which is important, but because of the widespread nature and barriers that people face, we're all creating history each and every day. And I just want to celebrate all of us who are doing that in our lives. And I get joy just from seeing people winning. It's just great.
Here, here. Well, thank you all for joining us today. Charlene, I can say I have the privilege to serve with one of your family members on a board, and your family is pretty amazing. So thank you. I will say this to the audience: the Black diaspora in Canada is amazing. It's wonderful, and we are more connected than I think we give ourselves credit for. Ray mentioned the quickness that we can have culturally because of our cues, right? So let's lean into that. I couldn't have imagined that I have to Charlene through a family member, and Alica, as I said, has been an inspiration to me since we were literally in the streets, calling attention to injustice in our community. So I really appreciate you. My joy comes from knowing that it's possible to bring our community closer together. And I would just ask to keep doing that work. Over the last 2 years, I've seen an acknowledgement of the need for us to close the gap between queer culture and the Black community. And I'm so grateful for the reconciliation that's happening within our diaspora. And I would encourage us to keep doing that, because as Mother Ruth says, if we can't love ourselves, how in the hell
are we gonna love anybody else?
So let's end on that.
Can I get an amen?
And hand it back to Anita with some Black joy today. Thank you everyone for joining us.
Alica, Charlene, and Ray, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today, for sharing your stories. You shared a lot of ideas for employers who might be listening today, and for each of us as citizens about how we can do our part to recognize, celebrate, and support our Black employees, our Black artists, and our fellow community members. I also heard a sense of urgency to address the challenges that we've been discussing for decades. David, thank you for guiding today's important conversation. Thank you again to our sponsors, TD, McCarthy Tétrault, and Power Corporation of Canada. We do appreciate your generous support of today's discussion. And thank you also to our AV supplier, Van Valkenburg Communications and LiveMeeting.ca for making it possible for us to gather virtually today. And listeners, we hope that you'll join us for some of our upcoming events. In fact, tomorrow, February 16th, we host a discussion on Canada's post-pandemic immigration strategy, featuring the Honourable Sean Fraser, Canada's Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship, and Goldie Hyder, President and CEO of the Business Council of Canada. And on February 23rd, our expert panel focuses on the increased expectations of the S in ESG, social responsibility. They'll discuss increased investor attention to the social factors that help to create returns and how it is increasingly material to the bottom line and not unrelated to today's discussion as well. To learn more about our upcoming events, please explore our website at canadianclub.org and browse our rich archive of past events and check out our new membership categories with enhanced benefits at every level. Please consider becoming a member. Guests, thank you for joining us. Please stay healthy and stay safe.